Well, here we are again. This is Mark from the Beaverton Church of Christ in Beaverton, Oregon. Our website is beavertonchurchofchrist.net. Phone number 503-644-9017. You can pick up the Bible, and there's a number of different passages. I want to start at 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 5, where God basically tells you what to fix about your life. And this set of scriptures, we have things to add to your life. It says in verse 5, for this reason also, applying all diligence, in your faith supply moral excellence, or virtue, or integrity, and in your moral excellence, knowledge. In your knowledge, self-control. In your self-control, perseverance. In your perseverance, godliness. In your godliness, brotherly kindness. And in your brotherly kindness, love. There's a number of things to add to your life. In Colossians chapter 3, we have a similar section, things to remove from your life, and then the things to replace them with. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, he says, consider the members of your body as dead to immorality. And right there, that would be sexual immorality, like fornication or adultery, things like that. Impurity, passion, evil desire, greed, which amounts to idolatry. It says in verse 7 that these people that Paul is writing to actually lived in these things and were walking in them. This was definitely part of a lifestyle. These had been habits. Verse 8, some other things to put away. Anger, wrath, slander, and malice, and abusive speech. Typically sort of things that come out of your mouth. And then he says, next verse, don't lie to one another. There's another category of speech. Seeing you put aside off the old man with its evil practices. Then he says in verse 12, here's the things to put on: compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, forgiving one another. It's easy to look at passages like this and be kind of overwhelmed by the passages and think like, wow, there are so many things I need to work on in my life. There are so many things I need to get rid of, and there are so many things I need to put on, and you can really kind of get overwhelmed by it all. And maybe you feel that way when you read the passages. Maybe the passages kind of intimidate you a little bit. Go like, whoa, can I really do that? In addition to that, the devil's going to try to convince you that you've got so many things wrong with you that it's pretty useless to even try. Or you're just too far gone. Or the sinful habits you have you've had them so long, and you practice them so long that you've just like forged them now out of steel. And they're like chains that really can't be broken, or not broken easily at all. Or the devil may try to convince you that, you know what, no one can really change. I mean, the only change out there is superficial change. Yeah, people might clean up themselves on the outside a little bit, but on the inside, they're the same old rotten individual. So the devil may try to tell you that. Maybe you start reading the Bible. Maybe you start going to services. Maybe you get into a Bible study. And maybe you kind of start cleaning up your language and stuff like that. And the devil's going to come along and say, you're not fooling anybody. You're the same old stinky rat on the inside. And you go like, oh, maybe I am. Or the devil might say, you know what? And if you're in a sin, and maybe you're a liar, or you're a thief, or you're a fornicator, or you just like to drink and party and stuff like that. And the devil just might say, you know what? You're always going to be like that. That's who you are. And you can't be anything different than that, because that's just who you are. Or that God expects too much of you. Or nobody. No one really can get away from that. And what doesn't help as well, is that you're going to have a number of friends who don't want you to change either, because it's to their advantage that you don't change. If you start changing, then that puts more of the spotlight on them. That is, Well, if I'm changing, why aren't you changing? If I can do this, you can do that. And they don't like it when you start changing because now they feel uncomfortable that the spotlight's now on them. Is that, before you were just all in a group. Before, well, we're all this way. Before, well, we're all irresponsible, so none of us feel uncomfortable about being run another. Misery loves company. We're all sinners. We all know that. We're not pretending to be anything different. But now one of you says, I want to start living differently, then that kind of exposes the rest of the group that something's wrong with them and that they need to change. I mean, if you're with a group of friends and you are all financially irresponsible, you all don't handle money well, well, then it's pretty comfortable to be around all of those people. But if one of you says, I'm going to stop being financially irresponsible. I'm going to start saving my money. I'm going to stop gambling it away and blowing it and things like that. And if one of you starts doing that, then the others are going to be pretty uncomfortable with the success this one person has. In 1 Peter chapter 4, there we find a situation where some Christians or some people had once been pretty irresponsible. It says in verse 2 that they had lived for the lusts of men. And in verse 3, that they had carried out a desire of the Gentiles. They had pursued a course of sensuality and lust and drunkenness and carousals and drinking parties, and that they had just lived that way. And you might be thinking, boy, that kind of sounds like me. But then they changed. And the next verse is interesting because it's verse 4 of 1 Peter 4. It says, in all this they are surprised. That is the people you used to hang around with and carouse and have drinking parties with, and etc. It says they're surprised that you do not run with them into the same excess of dissipation or just plain wastefulness. You got $80 out of the ATM Friday night. And you went out and you woke up Saturday morning and it's gone. And you're going like, well, where'd all that go? Well, it went for those drinks and those drinks and those drinks and whatever else you were doing. And you just blew it. That's dissipation. That's what dissipation is. It's just wastefulness. It was $80, $100 or whatever. And you wake up one day later and it's all gone. And you drank it all or whatever. And it's just where money is kind of going out of your wallet like a sieve. You got holes and etc. all over the place and just all leaking out because of your lifestyle. And here are the people that you used to hang out with. And everyone was real comfortable with one another because everyone was doing it and everyone was in the same situation and everyone was making the same bad mistakes. But since everyone's making the same really bad decisions, nobody feels uncomfortable that way. My life is a mess, but their life is a mess too, so that I feel okay. But once one of you breaks from that and says, I'm going to stop wasting my money, and I'm not going to do the drinking parties and the carousals, and I'm not going to sleep around anymore, and I'm not going to be irresponsible anymore and selfish and just kind of live for myself, and I'm going to be more responsible now. All of a sudden, all the people that used to hang out with kind of go like, well, what's wrong with you? You think you're too good for us? And they're really shocked. They're shocked that, why don't you do that anymore? Why don't you think that's fun anymore? What's wrong with you? You don't want to go out and drink a whole lot and not remember where you were and then end up hugging the toilet at 4 o'clock in the morning and vomiting and things like that. What's wrong with you? Don't you like to do that anymore? You go like, no, I don't. And they think like, what's wrong with you? That's also a challenge some of that includes family members where they don't want you to become a Christian because all of a sudden now you know what's wrong with them and you know that they're not the greatest person in the world. And you know that, and now you realize, wait a minute, I mean, these people that I thought were my friends are pretty selfish people. I was too. And not only that, but they really didn't care about me. And they need help. They got some serious problems. Now, the devil's going to try to tell you okay, how many times have you made New Year's resolutions? You're going to stop this, you're going to stop this. You're going to stop that, and you're going to start going to services and stuff like that. And what happened to that? Nothing happened with that, huh? And so the devil's going to try to say, we've heard all this before. I've heard all your promises before about how you're going to change and things like that, but you're just the same person you've always been, and that's all you're going to be. And so why don't you just settle into the rest of your life of failure? And we see a lot of failure, don't we? We see a lot of people try to change their lives. We see people try to get off drugs, go right back into it, right? We see people that are alcoholics and they start going to the AA meetings, and guess what? Guess what? They go right back into it. And so the devil's going to try to tell you, you know what? You're a failure and you're surrounded by failure. And why don't we just all accept that we're all a bunch of failures, and let's just get comfortable with that and accept that. You know what? And if you want to look for failure, you'll find it. You'll find failure in the Bible. You'll find a whole list of people who failed in the Bible. From Adam and Eve, who had perfect surroundings and they failed. Cain looks like he has pretty good parents, but he fails. The generation that came out of Egyptian bondage, that saw the plagues and the Red Sea opened up and God fed them with manna in the wilderness, they failed. Saul, King Saul, fails, and God, he has a prophet helping him, Samuel. And Judas spends 3 years with Jesus and hears the Son of God speak and hears great sermons and see great miracles and see people raised from the dead and stuff like that, and he fails. And you find some New Testament Christians that fail too, like Demas, who is spoken of as being faithful in Colossians 4, but over in the book of Timothy, I think it's 2 Timothy, he's loved this present world. So if you want to find failure, you can find it. It's not easy to find at all. But at the same time, we got a different list there that the devil doesn't want you to see. The devil doesn't want you to see some people who really didn't have any advantages, had very few advantages. In fact, people that you would have said, you know what, I don't think there's any hope of this person any improving. And those people really made some drastic changes in their life. In the book of Joshua chapter 2, Joshua sends in spies to spy out the land of Canaan, and they come to a woman's house, Rahab, and Rahab's a harlot. She's a prostitute. And before they go to bed that night, and Rahab has hid them upstairs, Rahab comes up and says in Joshua 2 verse 9, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And then she says, for the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. And then she says, save me and my family. And they said, we will. Stay inside your house and we'll save you and your family. Well, Rahab didn't have a Bible. She's never had a Bible study in her life. Rahab has never been to a religious service in her life. All the information that Rahab has is that she has just heard of what happened in Egypt. Well, that had been 40 years ago. 40 years ago, God brought them out. 40 years ago, God dried up the Red Sea. The incidents of Sihon and Og were a little bit more recent. Those are recent events. But 40 years ago, that happened. So here's a woman, no Bible, there's no church in town, no church yet. And yet, all she does is hear some information and she says, I know your God's a true God. And I want to side with you guys. You see, Rahab has like one day to make up her mind whose side she's going to be on, and she does. Now, a lot of people would say, what are the chances of a woman who's a prostitute ever coming to God? Well, that's what this woman is. And of all the people in Jericho, of all the outstanding citizens that were there, this is the one person who sides with God and says, hey, I can see the handwriting on the wall. Their God is the true God. I mean, I don't need anyone to draw me a pie chart. I can see that. All right. Another example is in the book of Jonah, where Jonah the prophet is sent to the city of Nineveh. These people don't have Bibles either. And he is sent there, and he shows up, and on the first day he walks, and he goes one day's walk, and as he's walking he cries out, Jonah 3:4, and says, yet 40 days Nineveh will be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed in God, and they called a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. Word reached the king of Nineveh. He arose from his throne, laid aside his robe from him, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat on the ashes. He issued a proclamation and said, in Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let a man, beast, herd, or flock taste a thing. Do not let them eat or drink water. Both man and beast must be covered with sackcloth. Let the men call upon God earnestly or diligently, that each man may turn from his wicked way and from the violence which is in his hands. Who knows, God may turn and relent, withdraw his burning anger so that we shall not perish. And guess what? Guess what? The whole town repented. Now, Nineveh was a big town. Earlier in the book of Jonah, it says Nineveh was a 3 days walk. It took 3 days to get through Nineveh. And so it's a pretty good sized town. I mean, there are a number of towns today that you could walk through in pretty much a day. But it was 3 days to get through Nineveh. That's how big the town is. And so there's a number of people in Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrians were, they were not cultured people. They were like Klingons. They were ruthless people. They glorified war, and they liked to stack up the heads of their enemies and things like that. They were rough, brutal, savage people. And if you would have said, not only what's the chance of just one person in Nineveh repenting, but what's the chance of the king repenting, and what's the chance of the whole town repenting? Because as far as I can read here, basically the whole town stopped sinning for a while. The whole town, immediately all drunkenness stopped, and all fornication stopped, and all adultery stopped, and people just stopped their evil deeds and practices. Cold turkey. It would be like someone showing up in Portland and saying, in 40 days, God's going to overthrow Portland. And all of a sudden, all the people in Portland, all the people in Multnomah County, all the people out there saying, we're going to repent. And so immediately, all the people that are living together stop living together. Everyone who's fornicating stops fornicating. Immediately, everyone who's having an affair stops having an affair. Immediately, everyone who's getting drunk and doing drugs and smoking dope and meth and all of that stuff, that just stops overnight. And immediately, all pornography stuff just stops. That is, no one goes online for it. No one goes into the local adult bookstore. And all of a sudden, no one shows up at the strip club. Not only customers, but the people that work there don't even show up. And all of a sudden, all of that ends. Well, that's what happened in Nineveh. And you'd be saying, what's the chances of that? Here are people these are not God's people. These are people that God has not spent time educating. These are people that do not have the scriptures. And yet one prophet shows up and says, God's going to destroy this place in 40 days, and the whole place changes overnight. Well, how do you account for that? Let me give you another example from the New Testament. It's in the book of Philemon. That is going to be before the book of Hebrews. In Philemon, we have Paul. Paul knows a man by the name of Philemon. Philemon was a Christian in Colossae. Well, Paul, of course, is now in Rome, and he's in prison there. Philemon had a servant named Onesimus, and Onesimus had been Paul says, a useless individual. Well, Onesimus had run away and had made his way east all the way to Rome. And lo and behold, had run into the Apostle Paul and became a Christian. And this useless man, Philemon 11, that's the word, useless, who was formerly useless to you, this man who was useless is now useful. So useful that Paul says, I really would like for Onesimus to stay with me in Rome because, I mean, he's a great assistant. He's really good at what he does. I could really use him, Philemon. He would be tremendously useful for me in evangelism and helping people and stuff like that. And yet Paul says, but that's not right. He belongs to you. And so I'm sending him back. But I'm sending him out realizing that he's now a brother in Christ and he's a very useful man. And you know, if he robbed you or stole anything when he ran away, Paul says, I'll pay for it. Put it on my tab. How do you explain Onesimus from going useless to useful? I want to give another example here of how radically people can change and how quickly they can change. In the book of 2 Kings 5, 2 Kings 5, there's a man by the name of Naaman, and he is a general in the Syrian army. It looks like he's the top general. And the king really loves him. Well, there's a problem. Verse 1, he's a leper. He has leprosy. He doesn't have leprosy so bad that it prevents him from being a general, but leprosy doesn't get any better. And so eventually it's going to prevent him from being a general. Well, the Syrians go down to Israel and on a raid, on a typical raid, and they bring back some captives. But one of the captives that they bring back is a small girl. And this small girl starts working for Naaman's wife, or Naaman and his wife, becomes like a household servant. And the little girl, when she sees that her master has leprosy, says to the master's wife, you know, there's a prophet down in Israel that could heal your husband. Well, the wife hears that, and the wife probably says, hey, I'm all for that. Tells her husband tells the king, and the king writes a letter off to the king in Israel of, I'm sending my general down there to be healed by your prophet. Well, the king of Israel, who doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in the power of God, says, well, he's just looking for a fight. I mean, he's asked me to heal his general, and he's just gonna use this as an occasion for war. And then the prophet Elisha hears about them and says, hey, if you don't believe, but there is a prophet here, and send him down. And so Naaman comes down to Israel, shows up, and in verse 10 shows up, and the prophet Elisha doesn't even leave his house, doesn't even come out, but sends a message out that says, go down to the Jordan River and dip in it 7 times, and you will be clean. You'll be healed of his leprosy. Well, Naaman hears that, and Naaman is a general. Naaman is a very important man. And in verse 11, Naaman is furious. He's just enraged. And he went away and said, behold, I thought. And how many times does that get us in trouble when we have this mental picture of how the Bible's supposed to read before we read it? We got this picture of us, and we pick up the Bible, and the Bible doesn't endorse that picture at all. And the tendency is just to fly off the handle of, well, that's a dumb book. And that's kind of what Naaman did. Naaman had this idea. He had the idea of how it was supposed to go down. He had this idea that he would show up, and the prophet would come out, and he would be the center of attention. And everyone would see him. And the prophet would come out and wave his hand over the place, and there'd be a show. It would be spectacular. And he would heal the leper. Notice the text. The leper, which was him. He's the center of attention. And that's not at all what happens. And the healing would be some sort of fantastic show. And that's not at all. The prophet doesn't even come out and greet him. Almost ignores him, and just says, go down to that river and wash her 7 times, and that'll take care of it. And he is enraged, and he's furious, and he's insulted, and And then in the next verse, he says, well, the rivers up in Syria are a lot better than the Jordan. We got a lot better rivers than they have. And so he turned away and he went away enraged with the attitude, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Well, are you like that though? Have you kind of had this idea of what you thought the Bible might say about you, and you picked it up and you found that it didn't say that at all? I remember years ago, first time I picked up the Bible, I thought the Bible was going to basically tell me that I was a pretty good person. Well, I don't read it long, and suddenly I find that the Bible condemns me in about 7 things that are going to send me to hell. And the Bible does not say I'm a really good person. And that was a wake-up call. And Naaman has a wake-up call like that. And Naaman's ready to walk away. He's a leper. He has leprosy. And he is about ready to walk away, saying, well, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Now, right there, if you were in the audience, and if you were watching that, and watching him getting red-faced and huffing and puffing and etc., you would probably say something like, oh, there's no way you could ever convert this guy. This guy is a fool. He's got a chip on his shoulder. Talk about a jerk. Yeah, he may be a general, but talk about a jerk. Man, he is proud. He is arrogant. He's got a chip on his shoulder. Oh, man, where do you even start to try to help a man like this? And so you might have said, this guy has 100 things wrong with him. I don't know where to start to talk to about all the things that are wrong with you. And you might have just said, impossible case. He's impossible. No one can help a guy like that. Well, luckily his servants did not have that attitude. Luckily his servants came near and spoke to him and said, my father, that's humble, that's respectful. They knew how to approach him. Had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? Like go on some quest, like for the Golden Fleece, halfway around the world and fight titans and cyclopses and things like that. And if he'd told you to do something like that, you would have done it. You'd have went to the ends of the earth to get healed of your leprosy. Well, because the servants see something going down. The servants are looking there going like, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. This guy's got leprosy, an incurable disease. It's not getting any better. Parts of his body are going to start dropping off pretty soon. And here's his chance to get healed. And it's a very simple thing. Wash in the Jordan 7 times. And he's going to walk away from it. And maybe you've been in situations like that. You have seen people get the opportunity of their life. You have seen people, you've seen men who have met a woman, and that woman is like the best thing that's ever happened to them. And they start getting cold feet. And maybe you were their friend, and you're going like, oh, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. This is the best thing you've met. This is the best woman you have ever met. You do not deserve this woman. And you're getting cold feet. Or they get a job offer and they go, I don't know if I like to work those hours. And you go like, what? I mean, this is being handed to you. That's what's going on here. Luckily, Naaman listens to his servants and listens to the logic and says, well, you're right. So he goes to the Jordan, he washes the 7 times, he obeys God, and he's cleansed. Now, listen to the man who comes back. I don't know how long it took to get to the Jordan. I don't. I don't know if it took an hour to get there and back. Looks like it takes place the same day. But the Naaman that had showed up earlier that day is a lot different from the Naaman that comes back from the Jordan. When he returned to the man of God with all his company, 2 Kings 5:15, and came and stood before him, he said, behold now, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel, so please take a present from your servant now. And of course, Elisha says, no, you don't need to pay me. No, I don't want any reward for this. Now, instead of getting all bent on a shape of, what do you mean you don't want a reward? If I say you're going to get a reward, you're going to get a reward. No, he doesn't do that. Doesn't have that attitude, okay? Now, the Naaman earlier in the day would have had that attitude. But this is a different man. Naaman said, if not, please. You know, there's no please in the Naaman that shows up in 11 and 12, but there's a please here. Please let your servant at least be given 2 mule loads of earth, for your servant will no more offer burnt offerings or will he sacrifice to other gods but to the Lord. You know, early in the day, the Naaman that showed up had the attitude that the best rivers were in Syria. The Naaman that comes back from the Jordan has the attitude that the best dirt is in Israel. You see, this guy's been thinking, I don't know how long it took him to come back from the Jordan, but in the time that it took him when he realized he was cleansed, to the point when he came back to where Elijah lived, he had been thinking ahead. The first thing he had thought about is these people are right about God. They serve the true God. We don't. We got a lot of gods in Syria, but none of them are the true God. They got a lot of gods down in Egypt. None of them are the true God. There's gods over in Babylonia and Assyria. They're not the true God either. The true God is the God of Israel. And then this thought must have popped into his head. But I can't go to Israel anytime I want. You see, Syria and Israel were often at war. If I want to worship God, I just can't go to Jerusalem like other people do. I just can't go there because I'm of Syria and they're of Israel, and we're often enemies. I'm just not going to be able to go and worship there when I want to. And so he's thought ahead. Maybe he will allow me to take some dirt from Israel back and make my own altar in Syria, and I will be able to worship God there. I mean, that's thinking ahead. And then in verse 18, in this matter may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon, a false god in Syria, to worship there, and he leans on my hand. That is, Naaman has also been thinking about, like, he's healed of leprosy, but you know, he always got problems. He always got challenges. Now he knows that the God of Israel is the true God. He says, you know, part of my duties as the general is that when the king goes and worships this idol regularly, and the king expects me to be there with him. And what Naaman says to Elisha is, will God understand that? That is, will God pardon me? That's part of my job? You see, I realize that idol's nothing. I realize that's not a God there. But part of my job is I got to go with the king because he wants to go and worship there. And what do I do? You see, he's thinking ahead. It would just be like someone who picks up the Bible and they decide to become a Christian, and yet they know, but this is the week I usually go every Thursday to meet my friends at the bar. I mean, you think ahead of, there's certain things I can't do anymore. I can't go out drinking anymore. I've got a girlfriend, we're living together. We can't live together anymore. Those are things where you think ahead. I got a job that tries to work me every Sunday, but Sunday's the day of worship. I'm going to have to talk to the boss about that and see if I can get my schedule rearranged and be willing to work any other time but that time. Those are things that you think of when you think of obeying the gospel, think of becoming a a Christian. I'm going to go back home. I'm going to go back home and I'm going to have to tell mom and dad I'm a Christian now. I'm going to have to tell my brothers and sisters I'm a Christian now. And that's what that's what was dawning. The light bulbs in Naaman's mind were going off when all of a sudden he thought of all the ramifications of this decision, of this conviction, and of this belief. But the man who comes back is not the same man at all. The man who shows up is proud, arrogant, chip on his shoulder, very opinionated, very prejudiced. The man who comes back from the river is humble, contrite, pleased, very conscientious. You can change like that in a day. You really can. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't change like that. Don't let anyone tell you that, oh no, the best that you can hope for after 30 years of therapy is a little bit of improvement. That's the best you can hope for. Now, you may just be overwhelmed as you look at your life. You look at your life and you go like, there are so many things I need to work on. Where do I even start? Where do I even start? Kind of like one of those hoarding shows when you go into a house where people have been hoarding, and if you went in there, where would you start picking up? You can't even walk through the house. Where do you start to organize the house? The good news though, is that conversion's a little bit different than that hoarding episode. Let me give you a couple of scriptures here. Let me challenge you with a thought. And the thought is, yeah, you may have all sorts of different problems, but you may really only have one problem at the end of the day. All those different issues may only really go back to one or two really serious problems that you need to address. Now, let me give you a couple of scriptures to prove that point. In the book of James chapter 3 and in verse 16, it says, "For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing." Right there, the Holy Spirit said, if you've got jealousy in your heart and selfishness, you got a lot of problems. Because a whole lot of sins spring off of those two root problems. Which means that you can spend the rest of your life dealing with side issues and never fix yourself. Or you can immediately address the jealousy and selfishness in your heart, and all of a sudden, you may have had 100 problems and they're all gone. That's why some people never improve. They spend all their life addressing little side issues. But until you address the selfishness in your heart, you're never going to change. And so if you see someone who's been going to church for years and is just a scoundrel, it's not that the gospel's failed, it's that they've never addressed the selfishness in their heart. Hebrews chapter 3, we have a similar verse. Hebrews 3, it talks about the generation that came out of Egyptian bondage. If I were to ask you, how many problems did the generation out of Egyptian bondage have? You would say, well, thousands. I mean, where do you begin? They had all sorts of issues. God has a different perspective. God says, no, they had one problem. He says in Hebrews 3:18, he says, to whom did God swear that they would not be able to enter his rest? Well, to those who are disobedient. Then in verse 19, and so we see that they were not able to enter in because of unbelief. The Holy Spirit looks at the generation that came out of bondage, and he did not see 1,000 problems. He saw one problem, one basic problem, unbelief. A failure to trust God. If you don't address that, if you don't address the failure to trust God, you won't ever change. If you do address the failure to trust God, you will change overnight, like Naaman did. Let me give you another verse. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and in verse 10, The love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. That is from greed. Greed springs all sorts of side issues, all sorts of related problems. If you never address the greed or materialism in your heart, you will never change. If you do address the greed in your heart, you can change like that. And so that's why we can have, when you look at these three passages, this explains the two scenarios we have in the Bible. The one scenario of the Bible is where people hear God's voice, are around miracles, and never change. They never changed because they never addressed those root issues: unbelief, pride, selfishness, greed. They never addressed those. They never dealt with those. Therefore, they never change. On the other hand, we have people that have like zero advantages that change overnight. They change overnight because they decided to, instead of being unbelieving, I'm going to believe. Instead of being selfish, I'm going to be unselfish. I'm going to start living unselfishly today. Talk to anyone who is successfully living the Christian life and they will tell you the same story. There was a day in their life that they simply made the conscious decision, I'm going to stop living for myself. They just made that choice. I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to stop being selfish. I'm going to start being unselfish. They just made that choice that day. They heard the gospel, it convicted them, and they made the choice, here's the way I'm going to live. And they changed overnight. I mean, within that first week, a lot of people were confused. I mean, who do we have here? Last Saturday night, that guy was going out and getting drunk as a skunk. And a week later, he hasn't touched a drop. He is going to services. He's going to church every Sunday. He is praying. He's reading his Bible. Last week, he would look at porn every week. This week, he hasn't touched the stuff. Last week, he was angry. This week, things don't get him angry. What happened? Well, what happened was that person simply decided to deal with the root issue. I'm a selfish person. I don't like being a selfish person. I'm going to stop being a selfish person. I'm an arrogant person. I don't like that. I'm going to stop being an arrogant person. I am materialistic. I am greedy. I am covetous. I value things more important than people. I'm going to stop doing that. I'm just going to stop doing that. That's the key. That's the key. People that go to church for decades and never seem to get better are people who simply never deal with those issues and make the choice. Just make the hard choice. People who show up at services one week and all of a sudden are changed people are people who have made that conscious choice. Don't ever let the devil convince you that you're beyond help. Don't ever let the devil convince you that there's so many things wrong with you that there's not enough time in your life left to fix it. You can get your life together in a week. That doesn't mean that you're not going to have to do some maintenance work for the rest of your life. You will. But you can make a drastic change in a week. I've done it. I've seen other people do it. If you think your marriage is unsalvageable, your marriage can change in a week. It really can. When both people in the marriage start living unselfishly, it's amazing what can happen. The people that typically continue to have marriage problems are the people that continue to live for self at the end of the day. So what do you think about that? I offer home Bible studies. If you've tried a lot of different things, if you've tried self-help books and all that sort of stuff, and it hasn't done you any good, you got the power. You got the power. Are you tired of being selfish? Are you tired of rebelling against God? Are you tired of being arrogant? Are you tired of being opinionated? And are you tired of trusting your own wisdom instead of God's wisdom? Well, there's hope for you then. I will come into your home and we'll open up the Bible and show you amazing things from the Bible. We'll give you the evidence. You can decide for yourself. No high pressure. If we have one class and you don't want a class after that, I'll never call you back. You know, I got a busy schedule. I got other people who want a Bible study as well. But I got time to spend with you, and I'd like to get to know you and come into your house. Would you like another friend? Do you need some better friends? Do you need someone who really cares about what happens to you? Give us a call. I'll show up, and we'll have a Bible study. And you can ask any questions you want about the Bible and about what to do about things. And are you ready for that? Again, give me a call. My name is Mark. You may get the answer machine. If you do, it just means I've stepped out of the office for a little while, and I will come back, and actually a person will call you back. The number is 503-644-9017. If you'd like to email me, you can get on our website at beavertonchurchofchrist.net. There's an email link there, and that goes directly to me. Feel free to either set up an appointment or ask me any questions you might have. I hope this was helpful for you. And I'm praying for you. I'm praying for that you would want to obey God. You are worth saving. And you can change. And you can become the Christian that God wants you to be. Until next time. We will see you later. Thanks.